Okay, welcome to today's presentation by Jim Lapsley titled Creating Neighborhoods in Historic Woodland, Plat Maps and Additions. We are so excited to have Jim here, and we want to thank him for doing his talk today in celebration of the 150th anniversary of the incorporation of Woodland. Before we get started, we should take a moment to acknowledge that this virtual presentation is taking place throughout the unceded territory of California, home to nearly 200 tribal nations. As we begin this talk, we acknowledge and honor the original inhabitants of our various regions. A land acknowledgement is a critical step towards working with Native communities to secure meaningful partnership and inclusion in the stewardship and protection of their cultural resources and homelands. Let's take a moment to honor these ancestral grounds that we are collectively gathered upon and support the resilience and strength that all Indigenous people have sown worldwide. I work for the Yolo County Library, which is on the traditional unceded territory of the Ochodee-Winton Nation. We would like to begin by introducing our speaker. Jim Lapsley is a semi-retired American historian. He and his wife, Carol, have lived in Woodland since 1972 when they came up from Santa Cruz for Jim to pursue his PhD in American agricultural history at Davis. Carol was hired as a special education teacher in Woodland, and they settled here rather than in Davis. They raised their 2 children in Woodland and have lived in 3 bungalows, the latest for 39 years. A 2-story craftsman style on 2nd Street, which was built in 1913 on a lot and a half in T.J. Dexter's 1882 addition to the City of Woodland. For Carol, settling in Woodland was almost a homecoming, as her great-great-grandfather, David Cole, settled in Woodland during the late 1850s and early 1860s prior to moving to St. Helena. Jim's dissertation is about the California wine industry, the rise of Napa. It was published by UC Press and is titled Bottled Poetry. Jim directed continuing education programs in the agricultural sciences for UC Extension for 32 years and was an adjunct professor for the Department of Viticulture and Enology for over 20 years. He also managed a small winery, Orleans Hill, from 1980 to 2002. He continues to work part-time as a UC researcher on wine and grape history and economics. 6 years ago, Jim and Carol's home was on the Stroll Through History, and Jim joined the board. He is now in his 5th year as chair of the Stroll. 3 years ago, Jim began doing map and deed work at the Yolo County Archives, trying to understand the development of the city. The presentation he will be giving on the development of woodland neighborhoods and additions to the City of Woodland is based on his research and material from the Yolo County Archives. Jim's talk will last a little over an hour, and then we will provide contact information at the end for those of you who may have questions. So I'll turn it over to Jim, and thank you again for doing the presentation.
Thank you, Heather. And I'm going to share a screen here and bring it up. Come on. Okay, so we're up, and you can see that. Thank you again for the introduction. And I think it's particularly important to acknowledge the Native Americans that were living here and whose land we live on now. I'll just be touching on that very briefly when I talk about how things got divided up into sections, but it's a good point. So, creating neighborhoods in historic woodland, plat maps and additions. As Heather said, I am an historian, but I got interested. I've lived in Woodland now for a lot longer than I ever thought I would, and I like the valley a lot. But I decided to get interested in, or became interested in, woodland history and valley history. Is kind of a natural adjunct from the agricultural history that I'm interested in. So some of the things that I've always wondered about when I here in Woodland is, why does Oak Street make a jog at College? You know, Oak goes east-west, but when it comes to College, it drops down and then it continues heading westward. I live on 2nd Street, so I'm conscious of 2nd Street. 2nd Street is a whole bunch wider between Oak and Main than to the south. And actually, pretty much whatever street you're on in historic Woodland, if you go up a couple blocks, you'll notice that the other streets don't quite line up, or maybe it was 60 feet and now it's 58 feet wide. There are Victorians on one side of College Street and bungalows on the other side, south of Pendergast. So if you go south on College Street and you go across Pendergast heading south, on the right, meaning the west, you've got these nice well, they're all nice Victorians, but the big 2-story homes that were built in the 1880s, 1890s. Whereas on the left-hand side, there are a bunch of generally 1-story bungalows what happened there? Why? And the answer to all of these, and probably most of your observations about woodland, is that woodland was composed of properties of different sizes. They were developed at different times, and how they were developed as additions to the city of Woodland is part of what I'll be talking about. And so the aim of this talk is to help you understand how woodland became woodland. And if you have a home in the historic portion of Woodland, which is bounded basically by Beamer to the north and now Gibson to the south and East and West Streets, this will also help you perhaps understand how to do some research and how to find your own maps and additions. So the topics I'm going to cover today briefly are about sections and property ownership. Then I want to talk about deeds versus plat maps. Then I'm going to jump to an 1869 map, which is the first map that I found in the archives. Underhill's, who was the surveyor for the county of Woodland, did a map of the town of Woodland. It wasn't a city yet, and we can kind of look at that and see what the properties looked like and what the sizes were. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about some additions prior to the incorporation in 1871, talk about the incorporation of 1871, and then Woodland's expansion. Now, Woodland itself didn't expand, but the additions that were made to, as people subdivided their parcels into essentially lots. And then I'd like to end with a case study of the Bynum addition, which is to the south of us. So let's locate Woodland and understand the township and range system. When the US was surveyed, and California as well, there was a system is still used called township and range. And a point will be taken as the central point that we measure from, and a north-south line will be drawn and an east-west line through that point. For Northern California, it's Mount Diablo. So we're on the Mount Diablo meridian. Then as the surveyors would go north or south or east or west along that meridian, they would create townships. And these aren't really towns. You've got to understand that. They're a unit of measurement. And they're 6 square miles. So they hold 36 square miles, but they're 6 by 6. And within each township, there are 36 sections. A section is 1 square mile. So this would be an example of looking at townships and the sections within them. And here we are in Woodland. We can see, for example, our township 10 north, range 2 east, and this is part of Woodland. We're going to get into this a little bit deeper here in a moment, but I just happen to really like this map. It covers all the way from Sacramento over to Napa, and it's a great resource. So the 1858 survey, which is shows us that we're township 10 north, 2 east. So what that means is that a township 6 miles, so we're 60 miles north of Mount Diablo, and we're east 2 townships, so we're 12 miles east of the north-south meridian of Mount Diablo. And Woodland becomes part of 2 sections, section 29 and section 32. And I'm going to use my mouse, and can we see this? Yeah, okay. So here is section 29. And sections can be divided into quarters, which are not surprisingly called quarter sections. A section is 640 acres. A quarter section is 160 acres. And then these coordinates can be used to describe land that falls within these quarter sections or the sections, and you can go quarter sections, which would be 40 acres. And but these are the 2 sections which Woodland is originally was composed of, where we've expanded much beyond that. And so this is August of 1858. So the black line shows basically what became the historic town of Woodland when it was incorporated in 1871. We can see that this top part is section 29, the bottom part is section 32. So Woodland was composed of the southeast and southwest quarter sections of section 29 and the northeast and northwest quarter sections of section 32. And actually, so that if we were looking at that, then we'd say that Woodland was 640 acres. It was a little bit larger, as we're going to see, because it actually extended a little bit south. So cleaning that up and just kind of thinking about present day, we have section 29. Main Street was a section line. And oftentimes when sections were divided out, the section lines would be the lines where streets would be, or main thoroughfares that were, say, be owned by the county. So Main Street is actually a section line. East Street and West Street are section lines. College Street, which runs north and south here, is a half section line. It divides both section 29 and section 32 on the north and south basis. Beamer Avenue to the north was also a half section line for section 29, and it divides it east and west. And Pendergast Street is a half section line for section 32, dividing it east and west. As I said, we actually go down a little bit to Bartlett Street, as we'll talk about in the incorporation. So what this means is, because we know that a section is a mile wide, or 1 mile by 1 mile, then the distance from East Street to West Street is 1 mile. The distance from east to College and College to West is a half mile. From Main Street north to Beamer is a half mile. And from Main Street south to Pendergast is a half mile. And it's a little bit more to Bartlett. So this is just to kind of get us oriented. The people who originally came into Woodland settled in the 1850s, and they claimed that the land was vacant. And this is where I want to go back to the native population that was living in various parts of the land, was scattered and maybe not in the settlement here. As part of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, in the war with Mexico, the United States promised to honor all land claims that had been created by the Spanish or the Mexican government, and those were ranchos. This area of Woodland didn't have any land claim. So this was considered to be federal land that people could buy from the federal government. And so you could go in and claim land, have it surveyed, file a petition to buy the land, and then wait. But ostensibly, it was your land at that point. And in fact, for example, Freeman is buying and selling, and Pendergast is buying and selling. He's here in 1851 or 52, I think, and Pendergast is here in 1855 in Woodland. They don't get clear title to their land until the 1860s, actually 1865, after the Civil War. But if you go back to the deed books, you'll see that they were buying and selling, and somebody else then bought some land from them and then resold it to somebody else, and it becomes complex very quickly. The state of California was granted some of the land, and they then would sell it. But as part of the federal, the warrant system, you could go in and you could claim land and say, using John Pendergast here as an example, this is from Pendergast Street up to Main Street, this is a quarter section, so it's 160 sections. He's getting half of that going east-west, and so he's claiming 80 acres, and he can buy it. You could buy it either for cash, or if you had served in the military, or had somebody, an ancestor who had served in the military, they were oftentimes partially paid in land warrants, which could then be redeemed. And in some cases, you might actually, a soldier might have a land warrant, and they might sell that land warrant to someone for whatever the going transaction rate would be at the time. So these were either purchased for cash or as warrants. And you can actually find the warrants, but we're not going to show them to you now. So why is a plat map? A plat map basically is a map that shows how the land has been divided up, and in our case in Woodland, into lots. So early in Woodland, blocks of land were sold using descriptions based along the section lines. They were complicated and they were involved. I'm going to show you one here in just a moment from Mrs. Cross. And so that involved a surveyor who had to go out and measure each transaction, and it was complex. If you instead said, well, I've got a plot of land, say it's 5 acres, and I want to divide it into 10 half-acre plots or lots, I can then go and pay a surveyor once to measure this all out. It's all going to be uniform. Draw a map, The map will then be put into the deed books, and the lots will be numbered 1 through 10. And then I can later say, based on this, I am selling lot 1 to so-and-so for X amount of money, and it doesn't have to be resurveyed. So that becomes a lot easier. So let's compare John Pendergast's sale of 2.5 acres to Mrs. Cross in 1864, and compare that with his division of some of his property in what was called the Pendergast edition in 1874, 10 years later. Now I want to say something here. When I first came to Woodland, I assumed that Cross Street was named Cross Street because it went across town. And I later found out that no, it's named for Mrs. Cross, and she was a teacher in the Hesperian College, it was called college, which was basically a primary, intermediate, and high school that was religious by the, what was a religious group, let's see, the Christian Church was what it was called. And I'm not going to spend time on that, but you know, here she was, she'd come in, the church starts in the Hesperian College starts in 1861, and she was in charge of the lower grades. And she and Pendergast, who also was the main minister for the church, sell some land to Mrs. Cross so that she can have a home. Nice. So this is the deed of John Pendergast to Carrie Cross. And I'm not going to read it to you. It's way too involved. We're going to look at a little bit, but it starts off that this indenture made by the son gives us the dates, has a lot of legal language. It goes on down. And finally, down in this part right here, we're going to dig in. And it says, okay, we're saying that it's in the Township 10 North, Range 2 East. Remember, we described that, so we're in the right one. And what the section number is section 32, because it's the south half, and of Mount Diablo. And it says beginning at a southwest corner of B.H. Pearson's and running south 22 rods and a half to a stake in William Music's property. And thence he's east, and you keep going. You can see you're measuring with rods and chains to physically carve out this 2.5 acre parcel that Mrs. Cross will be able to have and build a home on. By the way, her property is essentially the northern half of Cross Street between 2nd and 3rd, later on where the Woodland Clinic was. So she's just down the road from where I live on 2nd Street. Now, that's a detailed. You need to have that surveyed. It needs to be recorded in that nice script and put in. That's involved. 10 years later, Pendergast decides that he's going to divide part of his property. We'll see. We've seen part of his property. We'll see more of it later. But we have Cross Street. Cross Street. We have Railroad Street to the east, which becomes College Street. We have Oak Avenue, the one that has the jog in it, and we have Lola Street. So it's bound by these. Turns out that Lola was Pendergast's youngest daughter. And if you put a street in on your land, you get to name it. And so he names it after his daughter Lola. Oak Avenue is the northern boundary of Pendergast's parcel. Remember, he has 80 acres that goes basically from Railroad Street, later College Street, all the way over to West Street. And then he has given land to the city because the city was become a city in 1871. He has deeded land for this Cross Street to continue along the south side, because in order for him to sell these lots, people need to have access to it, right? So they're going to need to have a street. So this is an example of why the utility of additions or plat maps. Let's talk about the word addition for a moment. It says here, the map of Pendergast addition. The land was already in the city of Woodland. The city of Woodland was incorporated in 1871. Talk about that in just a moment. But why is it called an addition? And the short answer is, I don't know. It's a plat map. It's dividing the land into lots, but these were called additions. And so don't be confused that because it's an addition to the city of Woodland, that it was a new piece of land that was added to the city of Woodland. And to get things even more complex, later on, we'll show you, say, Jean's second addition, which is an addition to the city of Woodland. except that it was in the 1880s and it was actually outside the city of Woodland, but it becomes part of the city of Woodland later. So it's all very confusing when you look at the terminology. So this is a really neat map. I enjoy looking at it every time. And I'm sure that you right now looking at this can't really see very much, and I'm going to divide it into quarters. But this is 1869, so it's 2 years before Woodland has become a city. It's a town. We have a line running down here that is the railroad that came in 1868, I believe, and it moves east to East Street in 1872. But that's why with this railroad, what later becomes College Street, because of Hesperian College, was called Railroad Street. So we can see that these are all lots. And if you look here, up here just above Main Street, and maybe a little bit east and west of what becomes, this is First Street. This is all Frank Freeman's addition to the city of Woodland. This is the area where Woodland first started out. These are where there are small lots that have been divided with additions. Up here we can see some lots that have been divided, but they probably haven't been built on yet. And then as we get outside of this area, we start seeing much larger parcels. This is owned by Giddings, who is a farmer, who's a dairyman. He owns this land up here as well. We see an addition here. This is Fabricius's addition, which we'll look at in more detail in just a minute. Pendergast has all this land, except that he has sold, since this would have been 80 acres, so this is going to be 40 acres. He's probably sold 20 acres here to somebody. He's kept 20 acres for himself, and he's got this 40 acres here, and he's later on going to put in his addition to the city of Woodland right here that we just looked at. So the idea of looking at this is just to get a sense that in 1869 and then later 1871, when Woodland becomes a city, incorporates as a city, most of the land is held in large parcels, which will later on become subdivided and come in as additions. So going back to that map, I'm going to start here in the northwest corner, and we're going to go around the four quarters. So this is the northwest corner. We can see that Giddings, the dairyman, owns most of the land. There's a Fabricius addition and a Whitford and Ruggles addition that have been divided up. This is Elm Street. It hasn't been named yet. Note that both North and Cross dead end. They don't go through all the way to the west. And Elliott Street, which going to be up here, hasn't been named yet. So this is, we're still a town, we're not a city yet, and we're just starting to build out. Now we're going to the northeast part of Woodland, of the map. This is the area that Frank Freeman has subdivided and sold lots in. He originally had the southwest quarter section of section 29. That's 160 acres. He owned it all. When we're looking at this though, the only place where we see Freeman is G.N. Freeman. That's Frank's son. And by the way, this becomes 3rd Street. But Frank, the founder of the city of Woodland, doesn't own any of this property. Between getting the property, claiming it in the 1850s, getting his clear title in 1865, he has sold it all. He ends up buying other land in Woodland. That's a different story. But it's interesting how quickly these real estate transactions occur. We can still see the railroad. It's still angling north. It hasn't moved east to East Street. 2nd Street and 1st Street, well, 2nd Street dead ends on North Street. 3rd Street hasn't been subdivided. Basically, these are 10, 12 acre, 15 acre parcels that are later on going to get subdivided by whoever the owner is at the time. We're now moving to the southeast corner, so we're into section 32. We're in the northwest corner, pardon me, the northeast corner of section 32, which is the southeast corner of Woodland. And we can see that Lincoln Avenue and Oak Avenue exist. They've been named, but they don't go through to East Street, and they don't go actually very far. We'll be seeing the Sibley subdivision in just a moment, the addition, but he hasn't subdivided yet in 1869. Bynum owns this. He owns a whole bunch of land heading south all the way down to Gibson. And so remember, this was a quarter section and there was another quarter section. So that's 320 acres. Originally, Harris had 180 and Parsons had 180. Messenger has bought most of that land. Messenger has subdivided a little bit of the land as it heads north up to Main Street, and Bynum holds a whole bunch. So now we're moving to the southwest. So we're in the fourth quarter here. That would be, again, the northwest quarter of section 32, but the southwest quarter of Woodland. And we can see here, Pendergast had claimed 80 acres, received title to it. He still owns this. He still owns the area to the west. In fact, apparently he used to actually live in this parcel, and he later subdivides this. But most of these are fairly large. So the focus of the city, or what becomes the city, has really been the area just north of Main Street, a couple blocks basically 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Street. This was the area that Frank Freeman had set out. And then it creeps down a little bit south to where Hesperian College had been. So Hesperian College, Harris had owned, he had owned basically half of a quarter section, actually half of 2 quarter sections running north and south. He gave 5 acres to Hesperian College in 1861. And I think Hesperian College is a really important aspect because for Woodland, it's one of the things that made Woodland and attractive to farmers. Farmers were living out in the country. They wanted their children to be able to have an education. There were rural free schools, which were maybe kind of iffy. I don't know. It would depend upon the teacher, of course. But Hesperian College is offering training and education all the way up through high school, and actually they claim into college. And whereas Woodland doesn't have a high school until 1896. So Woodland becomes a very attractive place for farmers to build a home in the town of Woodland, later the city of Woodland, so that their family can have culture and that the children can be educated. And actually, Harris also gives another 5 acres over here to Burleson, who was the first teacher at Hesperian College. In 1863, Freeman, but I should say these two were both, they were not, they were deeds in the traditional way of describing it. Freeman puts out really the first plat map edition. And this is here, 1863. He lays out the land. He dedicates a square block for the county of Yolo to have a courthouse and for the county, and Woodland becomes the county seat for Yolo County. Meanwhile, he's dividing all these lands. We got Court Street, named after Court. North is the end of town from his perspective, and South Street is named South Street because it's south, but of course it's really Main Street. And much of this property would have been for homes, but along some of this, it would have been for businesses. And going back to the 1869 map, which we just gone through, you can see again, this would be the Freeman's plat map, and you can see how it's already being populated. People have bought different parcels or different lots within it, and we can actually see the names. And in fact, right over here is David Cole, my wife's great-great-grandfather. So the process of dividing it continues before Woodland becomes a city. Fisk and Messenger divide a small portion of their land. Remember, Messenger has all of this all the way south to Gibson. They divide it up, and you can see he has a whole bunch of small lots. Here's Main Street, and these others are basically large parcels, maybe a couple of acres, as opposed to lots that can be purchased from him. Whitford and Ruggles on the west side also divide up a small a parcel. I would say this is probably about 6-7 acres, something like that. That's 1867. And then to the north, a man named Fabricius. And if anybody listening to this lecture knows anything about Fabricius, I'd really like to know more about this gentleman, because he comes in and then disappears. I can't find anything about him. But he lays out all these lots, and nicely done. And he dedicates land for the roads, right? Roads, because we have to have roads. If you're going to have access to these lots here, you better have a road. So they're dedicating land. And this is 60 feet, 60 feet, and 60 feet wide roads. Sibley, who I mentioned just a moment, he was a carpenter. He had owned property just south of the Sperry College. This is going to be some prime real estate. And he divides it up into various lots, and some of them small, some of them quite a bit larger. And so these are some of the woodland additions. Well, this is an important one, again, that I'd like help from anybody in the audience. This is the Morris addition. John Morris was one of the original settlers in Woodland. This is up near Clover. And this is alluded to in many of the record books, but I haven't been able to find any deed or plat map that shows the actual division, but it's certainly alluded to in other editions. So this then is, we're getting into almost to the city of Woodland. This is 1870, all is 1870. Frost and Ruggles, remember Ruggles was down here. Ruggles was a pharmacist. He later becomes a court judge, a successful time in Woodland. They're dividing up some land here. We have Elliott, who by the time 1878, 79, he's been a land developer. He has 4 additions in Woodland, Elliott's North, South, East, and Elliott's additions. And he leaves, ultimately ends up in Southern California, where he becomes a land developer in Southern California, because that was a lot of people's things. But we can see that we're kind of leapfrogging, but we're also kind of working around a core. So in 1871, Woodland becomes incorporated as a city, which means that it's self-governing, and it was the first such city in Yolo County. This is from the Yolo County Board of Supervisors minutes, and we're going to jump down on the next slide to see the actual map. This is where they're describing, and again, they're using the whole section lines. Commencing at the northwest corner of the southwest quarter of section 29 in the township, all the things that we've already heard about, and then moving all the way around and along the Pacific Railroad. And this becomes then the legal description of the city of Woodland. And one of the things about being a city is that now you can tax. You have to have votes on this, but you can have taxing, and you can make your own decisions, your own laws. In fact, Woodland very early, for a very brief period of time, decides that they will not have any alcohol in Woodland, and that was a local option that could be done. So we can still see the railroad. It hasn't been moved yet. This is 1871. It's going to be moved in another year. We've got Main Street. Remember, this is a section line between these 2 half sections. They've added a little bit to the east of East Street, and a little bit to the south. Here at the bottom is Bartlett Street. And we have this little jump here because the Beamers wanted to be in the city of Woodland. And here it is. This is the Beamer home. This is from the Depew's Illustrated Atlas from, I think, 1879. But if you go up 3rd Street and go through the arches and look to the west, look to your left, you will see the Beamer house. It's been expanded, but this was the original, and then there was a little bit more added on. One of the oldest homes in Woodland. So this is another lovely map. The archives has 2 bird's eye view maps of Woodland, one from 1871, the other about 1890. We'll see that in a moment. I like these because of the perspective. We're looking from the south, looking north, and we can see here is the railroad. In fact, there's a train here, and it's going to be going on up. It hasn't moved yet. We've got Oak Avenue, Lincoln Avenue. So let's look at it north and south. So College Street, this is the north side of Woodland. Here's Main Street here at the bottom of this portion. Then we have Court, and then we have North Street. So this is Frank Freeman's addition that we've looked at. And this is showing, the artist is showing us buildings, and we don't know how quite accurate it is, but I think it's probably fairly accurate. We tried to be. And you can see then that we've got a hotel here on Main Street, but basically it hasn't filled in very much. We have outlying homes, and this is going on up 3rd Street. Here's the Beamer home up here. There was also a hospital which later gets moved. So this is the north part. And here's to the south side in 1871. I like this. Again, I live on 2nd Street, further south. But this is Lincoln, and here is Oak. On Lincoln, you notice that 2nd Street doesn't go through all the way to Main Street. There's a bunch of people that own homes or own parcels. They're going to have to give up land. And in fact, that occurs in about 1876 after the city. It's one of the first things that the city fathers do is they actually try to negotiate to buy the land so that they don't have to basically do condemnation and take the land. Hesperian College is here at the corner of what becomes College Street and Main Street. You can see College. And here is that jog. This is College. So this portion here is the northeast corner of Pendergast land. This is the road that he has given, land that he's given. So it becomes a continuation of Oak. This land, which had been divided north and south and been owned by Harris, was oriented differently when he had sold individual lands. So he donates land, and that becomes Oak Avenue. So that's why we have the jog. And we can see, well, yes, those are the main points. But again, it's a city, but it's pretty sparsely populated, a little over 1,000 people, maybe 1,500. So during the 1870s, we see some additions. The Bynum is first. Ed Bynum is the county clerk or county recorder. I've got to check that. But he has arrived with his wife and brood, his family, in the early 1850s. They have 8 children. His wife, Jean, later remarries after his death. And to the south, we'll find out about Jean's addition. In fact, I'll close this lecture with that. So they're an old family here. We have Welch. Remember, this had been Sibley up above. Now Welch is dividing this out. And we have Pendergast has decided that he's going to divide land. We've seen that one before. The railroad has been moved to East Street. Now with the railroad gone, this is much more desirable land. You don't have the train going right by you, and it is located around Hesperian College. So this becomes where we see a lot of the older Victorians that are still surviving. And to the north, we have Elias Northern, that's just above Fabricius, Meering, and Hopkins. I'm not going to be showing maps, and I'm not going to be spending a lot of time going through all of these. Heather and I have been working on, I should really say, the archives and I, Heather representing them, have been working on something with the City of Woodland to celebrate the 150th. And very soon on the City of Woodland's website, you'll be able to go to a Thomas Brothers map, which is a very detailed map from 1949 that actually shows the neighborhoods by additions. The additions are named for whoever had done the addition. And so you'll be able to find Frederick addition or Grafton addition. And then you'll be able to click on that and it will bring up an addition map, kind of some of the ones that we've been showing you as examples. And so you can actually go in and find your lot and whose addition it was. And that'll be a great aid in doing research at the archives. So we're excited about that. That's going to be happening soon. The only one that I'm going to mention, because I live in it, is the Dexter edition. And one of the also things to realize, Dexter edition, 1882, along 3rd Street, many of the houses were built fairly soon after the addition. We my wife and I are fixing up a very small working class Victorian on 3rd Street that was built in 1885. But our big California 2-story craftsman bungalow, which is where Laurel Street comes right in here, that wasn't built until 1913. So just because additions were made and lots were available doesn't mean that they were purchased or built upon immediately. So again, we're filling this up. So this is the 1880s. This is 1881 through 85. The next slide will show up to 1890. And basically, the 1880s were a boom period for California and for Woodland. So this was a great time for, if you were a property owner, to be dividing up your land, trying to sell lots, make some money. So see, this is again, in the decade of the 1880s, there were well over 20 additions. Of course, these are additions, not lots. I'm going back and counting the lots right now. So that brings us up to the early 1890s. We don't know the date of this map, but this is the other bird's eye view map. Unlike the other, we're on the east, we're elevated up, and we're looking west, and we're looking maybe slightly to the south. And again, it's more detailed. We're going to look at a little bit more of the north and the south side. But again, there's a lot of vacant land, a lot of parcels that haven't been subdivided. And even the ones that have been subdivided, they may not have homes on them. For example, here in yellow is the Pendergast addition. And so right along College Street, you can see these 1, 2, 3. These are what are called the Three Sisters. They're still there, and you can go look at them. So this is Cross Street and College. This here is what becomes Bynum's addition. And Bynum's addition was basically 3 blocks, because this is Cross Street and then Pendergast to the south. So it's 1 block deep. Those are long blocks, by the way. Then we have College, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, and going a little bit into the next part here. And you can see that there's some homes being built in this middle block, but these other 2, hardly anything there. And again, we'll explain about that. Population is now a bit over 3,000, still clustered, still lots of land available for subdivision. On the north side, we can see that we have 3rd Street is running all the way, and it runs into, the Beamer home again that was carved out. And we have College Street has now, since the railroad had been moved, this has now been expanded, and it goes all the way up to what becomes Kentucky. So in the 1890s, you can see that there were a number of additions up to 1892, and then we have 1894 and 1897. 1893, we had the start of a depression that was the worst depression in the United States history until the Great Depression of the 1930s. And so that really slowed down the subdivision and people buying homes or buying lots and building homes. So we have this early period where they're filling things out, but then as you're going to see, it slows down. See, we go from the Faulkner edition in 1897. The next edition is Leland in 1906. So there's a really hiatus during this long and rather horrendous depression. However, by about 1902, 1903, we've come out of the depression, the U.S. come out of the depression. Things are starting to boom again. We're starting to see more activity, business activity in Woodland, and again, more subdivisions. I do want to point out number 4 down here. This is City Park. It's not really an addition, but it really needs to be acknowledged. This is the first park in the City of Woodland, and it's done by 2 women's organizations. There was the Women's Town and Country Club, and not a country club, but it was Town and Country for rural and city women to come together. And these were generally wives of quite wealthy men. And then also the Shakespeare Club, the longest lasting women's literary club east of the Mississippi. And oftentimes there was overlap between of membership between the 2. They actually get together enough money that they buy land from 2 different people here and put it together, and it becomes Woodland's first park. And this again, these are all 1911. we're in a good period. There's things are prosperous. People are dividing things up. 1912, 1913, prosperity is still continuing, and we're adding more land. In 1912, the city actually extends itself. Bartlett had been the southern part, the southern edge of the city of Woodland. Excuse me, I'll go back. No, the city of Woodland. And this whole area had already been developed, but and considered additions to the city of Woodland, but they weren't really part of the Woodland. Woodland actually annexes this land all the way down to Gibson and adds to it. Later on, it will do this to the north in what becomes Beamer Park. So we have in 1914, 1915, we see some divisions here. This area here where we see the 1 and the 3, this is the Craig Riser, and then the Reith edition. I'm going to use this as a case study. This was the old Bynum land where he had 3 blocks, and we're going to come back to that. Here to the north is the Rebecca Beamer decides that she is going to divide her land as part of a company, and we create what becomes Beamer Park. And so this was the Keystone Investment Company, which is why we have a Keystone Street. I really like the way this map is done. This is coming in on 3rd Street. So this number 1 is the Beamer home, again, that we've seen. But then the rest of these are divided up into lots. Interesting layout. Later on, there will be another addition to Beamer Park to the west, but this is the original. And very interesting. This was on the wall in the archives 4 or 5 years ago, and I asked if we could make a copy of it for this. And this was basically part of an advertising brochure for Beamer Park, the nearest place to heaven in Woodland. Okay, now life has cheer and meaning at Beamer Park. This was being set up for commuters from Sacramento to be able to own land here. They could then come from Beamer Park, walk over to 2nd Street, take basically a streetcar down 2nd Street to 2nd and Main, where there was the Sacramento Northern Electric, which would then take them into Sacramento. And that the depot was later torn down there and was rebuilt by I'm drawing a blank of our favorite man here. Tell me, Heather. Unmute.
Tom Stallard.
Tom Stallard. Tom, forgive me. I'm getting old. But Tom did a great job with that, and it's really it's just across from Heritage Plaza. But what I really like there is, see, Beamer Park was not part of the city. In Beamer Park, you will have all the privileges of living in the city without having to pay city taxes, water, lights, sewerage, gas, and electricity. Let's actually go back to this for a moment. That's interesting because without sewerage, these meant that all these little lots had to have their own privy or septic tank. And the folks who work for the city of Woodland these days say they still find occasionally septic tanks not working because it's all been tied into the city sewer, but cave-ins occasionally from where they are. Okay, let's talk about the Bynum's edition, and then I'll conclude. So Bynum, it's 1871. He had purchased land, and he owns basically from College Street to between 3rd and 4th Street, because that's a quarter section line division. And he owns it from across street all the way south to Gibson. And so he decides that he's going to divide this land up, and he divides it into 3 blocks. And actually there's a 4th over here, which is a half block. And he puts them up for sale. And one person, J.D. Stevens of the Bank of Woodland, who founded the Bank of Woodland, buys the entire block and puts a home on it. In block 3, the Loganauers, an old family, buy this and they build their home. This actually does get purchased by an individual who then starts selling off, divides it up, not as an addition. not as a plat map addition. He is using the old coordinates and selling off parts of it. And I've still got to do some deed work on that. But so this is going to show us how things get divided and how it influences architectural style. So the 1892 Fidelity National Map actually shows property ownership. And we can see J.D. Stevens, Loganauer. The block in the middle has already been divided up in kind of an odd sorts of ways, but clearly it's not lots, even lots, as an addition would be often done. This has been done where somebody has purchased this land and then they've carved off this. And so that's why part of the charm of this middle block is that the lots are uneven in size. And because they've been sold off at different times, the homes have different architectural heritages. So Stevens and Loganauer have these large lots. And this is going back to the map of 1890 that we've seen the bird's eye view. We got J.D. Stevens, we got Loganauer. Across the street is the Gable brothers with the Gable mansion still there, and then the three sisters. So again, this is from the Depew Illustrated History of Yolo County. This is the John D. Stevens mansion. Stevens was a very wealthy man. He businessman. He founded the Bank of Woodland, did many other things as well. There was another, he also had two nephews who are Stevenses who also did very well. So if you're ever tracking the Stevens family lineage, you have to be aware that they're interrelated, but it's not sons and daughters and so forth. But this is a picture of him, of the house. And you can see this circular arch. I want you to remember that. So Stevens dies, and after his death, well, he had given this to his daughter Kate, who had married Joseph Craig, and Kate dies. And so after her death, her husband, Joseph Craig, goes in with Frank Reiser, and they decide they're going to subdivide the property around the mansion. And they sell the house, actually, to Coyle, and it gets torn down in the 1930s by Matroni, who's one of the major builders. He builds a modern Spanish-style home. I'll show you a picture here in a moment. But you can see, again, this is a long walk from Cross to Pendergast. So they decide they're going to put another street in here, Craig Street, of course, and that way they can get more lots in to sell. If you walk down Craig Street, we're looking north here. If you walk down Craig Street, you'll see that there are two alleys. And I think that originally this was supposed to tie in to the major property that was kept. It doesn't now, there are walls, but it does serve as alleys for these various homes and that. So this now is the picture of what had been the Stevens property. It's been torn down. Matroni has built this really lovely Spanish style two-story home, but we still have the nice circular drive. So here we are on Cross Street. Okay, now let's move down to Loganauer. Oh, no, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's look at the two sides of College Street. So the eastern side of the Craig's property, which they subdivided, gets divided in 1914, and houses aren't immediately built on it. But when they are, they tend to be bungalows. So as we're heading south on College, and we're going south of Cross Street towards Pendergast Street, on the left-hand side, meaning the east side, we see these really quite lovely small bungalows. On the west side of the street, right-hand side as you're heading south, these were lots that had been sold in the 1880s, and they were built as Victorians or much larger homes, much larger style. For example, this was the first home we see here was built as a Victorian. It was since later remodeled with stucco, but you can see just the scale is quite different. And so again, when the property gets divided, influences, and how large the lots will be, influences the style of the home that's going to be built in terms of the predominant architectural style at the time, and bungalows were very popular in the 20s and 30s. Now, moving east on Cross Street, we skip the middle block and we see the Loganauer home. And again, this is from Depews, similar sort of circular drive, grand Victorian. Well, it ultimately gets sold to John Reith. I may be mispronouncing his name, it might be Reith. And he was a businessman who owned the Woodland Gas and Electric Works. And he had purchased the property sometime before 1900. Again, have to do some deed work there. And he decided that he was going to subdivide that. In 1914, he submitted a plat map to the City of Woodland. And then he actually revised it in 1916. The original plot map had this one, which would be where the house was and where he was living, much larger. And so you had fewer lots being divided, and the alley was further to the south. He apparently decided, well, I don't need to have that large a lot, and I can sell a couple more lots if I divide it this way. So he divides it up this way, and this becomes then the map. Across the street is the Woodland Clinic, and they later actually end up buying this property, and it becomes part of a parking lot, and this gets divided up later and built much later, whereas these homes are built earlier. So the block to the west was divided in the 1870s. It contains homes that are of a quite different style, and most of these homes, which are it's been divided up in 1916, built in the 20s, are bungalows. And again, you can see this. This would be the Reith edition. Again, very nice bungalows. This is going up 3rd Street. So now you know why Oak Street jogs. It was the property lines and who owned what land at what time. Why 2nd Street is wider than Oak and Main. Between Oak and Main, it was added as a street later, and it was made wider by the city when they did the condemnation process. And you understand why Victorians aren't on both sides of College Street south of Pendergast, because we had the Craig Reiser addition in 1914. I'd like to conclude with a story. It's kind of a sad story, or at least parts of it are. I had said that Rachel Bynum, Rachel Bynum was Ed Bynum's wife. They had come to the Woodland in the early 1850s. He became the county clerk, and they owned property together as husband and wife. And they had 8 children, and in, I believe it was 1858, their diphtheria came through, and 7 of their children died in a week from diphtheria. Now that's the really sad part. I mean, these were kind of isolated or insulated from these sorts of things with modern sanitation, just how uncertain life was and how infections could come through and wipe out a family. So they had 1 child left of the 8. He dies in, I believe, 1880, and she remarries a man named Jeans. So she becomes Rachel Jeans, and she remarries in 1893. But this is property that she had owned with her husband Bynum, and she owns a whole bunch of property, basically from Pendergast south down to Gibson, and it's her property. So she had made Jean's 1st edition, which was just to the north, and then she has Jean's 2nd edition to the town of Woodland. So to the north is Bartlett Street. That was the edge of town. So Jean's 2nd edition is actually an addition, quote unquote, addition to the City of Woodland, but it's not part of the City of Woodland because Bartlett Street is the southern edge of the City of Woodland. And it just shows the blocks. But what I really wanted to show you, well, there's another thing you might look here is there's Hesperian Street because the college was going to be moving. This is no longer Hesperian Street. But what I wanted to show you here was at the bottom part. So this is done in 1888, and she is a married woman selling property that she owns. And she appears, she says, so on this December 18th, 1888, before C.W. Thomas, Court Commissioner in Oviedo County, personally appeared Rachel Jeans, formerly Rachel Bynum, known to me to be the same person whose name is subscribed to the written instrument. So in other words, she signed the deed that she wants to do this. described as a married woman, and upon an examination without the hearing of her husband. So her husband they've taken Rachel, or he's taken Rachel away from her husband, and he's saying, is this really what you want to do? Are you doing this of your free will? And he said, I made her acquainted with the contents of this instrument. You signed this. This is going to be legal now. And thereupon she acknowledged to me that she executed the same and that she does not wish to retract such execution. In doing deed work, I've found several instances of things like this where a married woman who has separate property is basically taken apart and is given a chance to essentially retract what's being done to make sure that she's not doing this under redress. Once we get into the 1900s, you don't see this anymore. And so it's both paternalistic but protectionist. And I guess that's the good and the bad side of that. I just find this very interesting. We're going to conclude with that. So I hope you found it interesting. Tom Stollard, I'm really sorry about that, but you've done so much for the City of Woodland, and we very much appreciate it. The maps that I've used in this presentation were all from the archives. I happen to really like maps. These are very useful. And the ones with the 2 stars show ownerships of parcels and lots. So we have the Underhill map of Woodland and the Fidelity map of 1892. These are both really good starting points if you're ever doing research and you want to be able to jump in, because we have deed books that show who is selling and who is buying, and that would be the grantor and the grantees. And the grantee is the person who's receiving the property. And by looking at these names and having a sense of date, you can start to go back and forward, focusing on names to see when property transactions occurred. So it can be really quite useful. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention. I really want to thank Heather Langto and Ruby Puenteo. And I also want to thank Eric Seastrom and John Harriman at Placer Title. John has been there for 40 years. He has retired since I did this. I had this when I was giving the presentation 3 years ago, and he was just getting retiring, and I forgot to make that to thank him, and so I wanted to thank him there. But Heather and Ruby are just doing a wonderful job for us at the archives, and I very much appreciate your effort there too. So with that, if you have any questions, jtlapsley@gmail.com, and I'd be happy to answer them. And I hope that this has got you thinking about the neighborhoods in Woodland, and I look forward to hearing from you. Heather, back to you.
Thank you so much, Jim. I think your presentation was wonderful, and it's going to be a fantastic resource for people who are interested in learning more about Woodland and its development and how things have sort of built out over the years. I did want to mention just briefly a couple of other maps. The official map of Yolo County from 1915 and 1926 are also great maps. They show property ownership in Woodland. And yeah, as Jim said, feel free to reach out to him if you have questions about his presentation. You can also reach us at the archives via email or by phone. We're archives@yolocounty.org, and our phone number is 530-666-8010. And you can either see some of the maps that Jim provided in his presentation, or we can start researching your home. So thank you, and have a great rest of your day.